Good morning. Today's lesson is going to be on Caleb and believing God's promises. It's from Numbers 13:23b. They cut off a branch, bearing a single cluster of grapes. Two of them carried it on a pole between them. So in the Bible, we read about the people of Israel. They have been slaves for 400 years in the land of Egypt. Then God sent 10 terrible plagues, and at last King Pharaoh let the people go. Moses was their leader, and God sent a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to lead the people to the promised land. They traveled through the Red Sea and across the desert. Finally, they got to the border of the land that God had promised to them. It was a rich and wonderful land, but wicked people who had strong armies lived there in cities with high walls. Some of these people were even giants. Moses sent 12 spies into the land to find out more about it. The 12 spies looked at the beautiful land, and to show the people of Israel how fruitful it was, they cut down a bunch of grapes that was so big they had to put it on a pole. 2 grown men had to carry it between them to keep it from dragging on the ground. Can you imagine how big the bunch of grapes was that Caleb brought back from the promised land? 2 grown men had to carry it on a pole between them. You would think that the people of Israel would have been anxious to go to that wonderful promised land, but they became afraid when the spies told about the giants and the walled cities. God had cared for the people of Israel in the desert. He had given them manna and quail to eat and water to drink. God had even kept their shoes from wearing out, but they forgot how great God is. They didn't believe God's promises. Only 2 of the 12 spies, Joshua and Caleb, believed that God could protect them and would bring them safely into the promised land. Joshua later became the leader of Israel. God gave a special promise to Caleb too. All the other people of Israel over 20 years old would die in the desert, but because Joshua and Caleb believed God's promises and trusted in him, they were able to go into the promised land. Many years later, when Caleb settled on the land given to him, he must have had a vineyard of grapes. Maybe they were great big clusters so that he needed the help of his children to pick them. Every time Caleb picked grapes, he must have been reminded of God's promises. Caleb believed God's promises, and he entered the promised land. God has promised that one day we will be with him in heaven. Heaven is our promised land. We need to trust Jesus to bring us there, just like Caleb needed to trust God to bring him into the promised land long ago. Every time you see a bunch of grapes, think of how good and great God is. Let the grapes remind you of God's promises about heaven, and then place your trust in him. So with this story, you do need to put your trust in God, because he will always be there for you, and he will always, always answer you. So just give this some thought, think about it, and I hope you have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and I'll see you real soon.